People walked past him every day. Some stared, some ignored, some judged. He sat on the cold pavement, holding nothing but silence. One day, someone finally stopped and offered him money, but what the beggar asked for instead left the man speechless. On the side of a busy city street, where cars rushed by and people hurried to their destinations, sat an elderly man named Raghav. His back was slightly bent, his hair graying, and his clothes worn thin from years of struggle. He didn't hold a sign. He didn't beg loudly. He simply sat beside the wall of an old building with a small cloth spread on the ground. People assumed he was just another homeless man asking for coins, but no one knew his story. Raghav had once lived a very different life. Years ago, he worked as a carpenter in a small workshop. His hands were strong and his work was beautiful. He crafted tables, chairs, and wooden toys, each piece made with care. He lived in a modest home with his wife, Mira, who always waited for him at the door with a smile. They dreamed simple dreams, to grow old together, to watch the sunrise from their small porch, and to keep their hearts full even if their pockets were not. But life, as it often does, changed without warning. Mira fell ill, and the cost of her treatment was more than Raghav could bear. He sold his tools, then his furniture, and finally their home. He worked day and night, but nothing was enough. Mira passed away in a cold hospital room, holding his hand and whispering, "Take care of yourself." After losing her, Raghav lost his will to continue the life he knew. He had no children, no savings, no relatives who cared enough to reach out. He drifted from town to town, taking small jobs until his aging body could no longer keep up. Eventually, he ended up in the city, sleeping wherever the night allowed and sitting near the same street corner every morning. People walked past him with expressions he had learned to read. Some looked at him with pity, some with annoyance, others with complete indifference. He never asked for money, but sometimes people tossed coins onto his cloth, thinking they were helping. He would quietly gather what little was given and use it to buy a piece of bread or a cup of tea that he sipped slowly to make it last. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, he watched the world move without him. He listened to laughter, footsteps, and conversations that had nothing to do with his existence. Still, he held on to something inside him, a quiet dignity, a softness that hadn't died with his past. Dogs sometimes came near him, and he would gently share crumbs with them. Children occasionally glanced his way, curious but pulled back by their parents. He caused no trouble and made no noise. His presence blended into the background of the city. Like an old lamppost, no one notices unless it falls. Days turned into months. Seasons changed, but his routine remained the same. And although his heart carried pain, he never let it turn bitter. He longed for something he could not name, something more precious than coins, something people rarely offered. One cold morning, the wind swept dust across the street as Raghav sat wrapped in an old shawl. His hands, rough and tired, trembled slightly as he held them close to his chest. The sky was gray, and the world around him moved as though he didn't exist. Nearby, a few shopkeepers set up their stalls, glancing at him but saying nothing. He had become familiar to them, like part of the scenery. Some people avoided walking too close. Others whispered to each other as they passed. A young woman dropped a coin near his cloth without making eye contact. A man in a suit shook his head disapprovingly when his little son looked at Raghav for too long. Two teenagers laughed as they imitated the way he sat, pretending to be beggars themselves before running off. Raghav heard it all, but his eyes remained lowered. Later that afternoon, a group of office workers stood nearby during their break. One of them, a middle-aged man named Arjun, watched Raghav with a frown. "I don't understand why these people just sit here," Arjun said to his colleagues. "They should work instead of waiting for charity." Another co-worker shrugged. "Maybe he's pretending. You can't trust anyone on the streets these days." Raghav heard their words, not because he was trying to listen, but because cruelty always finds a way into the ears of the quiet. He didn't react, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. Pain had taught him silence. As evening approached, the street became busier. A group of school children walked past, chattering about their day. One little girl looked at Raghav and tugged at her mother's hand. "Mama, is he hungry?" The mother gently pulled her away. "Don't talk to strangers," she whispered, glancing at him with a mix of discomfort and fear. Raghav sighed softly. He wasn't angry. He understood. The world had grown afraid of sadness, uncomfortable with weakness, and impatient with need. People didn't see the human behind the worn clothes. They didn't ask. They assumed. That night, the cold grew sharper. The small cup of tea he had bought in the morning was long gone. His stomach ached with hunger, but he was used to it. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, pretending he was somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere remembered. But just as he began to drift into shallow sleep, he was jolted awake by the sound of harsh footsteps. A shopkeeper from across the street shouted, "You can't sleep here! Go somewhere else!" Without waiting for a reply, the man kicked away the cloth with the few coins Raghav had collected. The coins scattered across the pavement, rolling into cracks and gutters. Raghav looked at them, not with desperation but with quiet resignation. He slowly reached to collect what he could, his fingers numb from the cold. No one helped him. People walked around him as though he were a burden on the ground. His heart felt heavier than his body. For the first time in a long while, he wondered if his presence in this world mattered at all. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, casting a soft light on the pavement where Raghav sat. He hadn't slept much, and his body ached more than usual. Still, he folded his cloth neatly and placed it before him. The street vendors opened their shops, the traffic hummed, and people began their hurried walk to work. Around mid-morning, a young man named Kabir walked down the street carrying a paper bag. He worked at a small bookstore nearby and often took this route. That day his eyes landed on Raghav, not by accident, but because something felt different in the old man's posture. There was tiredness, yes, but also a deep loneliness. Kabir paused for a moment. Unlike others, he didn't hurry past. He didn't assume. He simply stood there, observing the lines on Raghav's face, the stillness in his eyes. Something tugged at his heart. He approached gently and spoke softly. "Baba, would you like something to eat?" Raghav looked up slowly, surprised that someone had addressed him with respect. He shook his head. "I'm fine," he whispered. Kabir didn't leave. He knelt beside him, placing the paper bag on the cloth. "There's fresh bread and some fruit inside," he said. "Please take it." Raghav hesitated, then asked quietly, "Why are you giving this to me?" Kabir smiled faintly. "Because you look like someone who hasn't been asked what he needs in a very long time." A silence settled between them, gentle and sincere. Raghav's eyes grew moist, though he tried to blink the tears away. People passing by glanced curiously, some confused by the sight of a well-dressed young man kneeling beside a beggar. After a pause, Kabir reached into his pocket and pulled out some money. He extended it toward Raghav and said, "Here, this might help you." Raghav stared at the money for a long moment. Then, slowly and softly, he shook his head. "I don't want your money," he said. Kabir looked surprised. "Then, what do you need?" Raghav lifted his tired eyes and spoke the words that had lived in his heart for years. "Talk to me. Just talk to me. I'm not hungry for coins. I'm hungry for a voice that doesn't judge me, for someone who sees me, not as a beggar, but as a man." Kabir felt something shift inside him. The money in his hand suddenly felt small compared to what was being asked. He put it away and sat on the pavement beside Raghav, ignoring the curious stares around them. He began to talk, asking about Raghav's name, his past, his craft. And slowly the old man spoke too. Words came out like fragile birds set free. He shared stories of the workshop he once owned, of his wife's laughter, of the life he had lost but still held in memory. Kabir listened without rushing, without judgment. He laughed gently at the small jokes Raghav made and kept silence where sorrow filled the pauses. And in that simple act of sitting, listening, and seeing, something beautiful happened. Raghav's shoulders relaxed. His eyes softened. For the first time in years, he felt human again. He felt visible. Before leaving, Kabir placed his hand on Raghav's shoulder and said, I'll come back tomorrow. We can talk again. Raghav nodded, his lips trembling into a faint smile. Kabir kept his promise. He returned the next day and the next. Soon others noticed and began to greet Raghav too. A tea vendor started offering him a warm cup each morning. A tailor near the street gave him a clean shirt, not out of pity, but because someone had reminded them he was worth knowing. And just like that, without asking for money, Raghav received something greater: connection, dignity, and kindness that did not measure him by the coins at his feet. Sometimes people don't need your money. They need your heart. A kind word can feed a soul more than bread ever could. Seeing someone with empathy can heal years of silence. Kindness begins when we stop assuming and start listening. Be the person who gives what truly matters.